You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Welcome to the 2023 Miami Dolphins season, and welcome to another edition of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern, back with you for more Dolphins talk as we get ready for Training Camp 2023. The players report tomorrow, Tuesday, as I'm recording this on Monday night, with the first practice coming on Wednesday, with Coach Mike McDaniel and quarterback Tua Tagovailoa scheduled to meet with the media then. Lots of excitement building for this season, and I couldn't be happier to be back at the mic for another episode. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4, and you can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Please give me a rating, give me a review if you're on iTunes. Would love to hear some feedback about the show. And if you guys have any questions about anything that you'd like me to address or talk about, I'd be happy to read those and get back to you on a future episode. I do apologize for the gap between episodes, but it's been the summer, the downtime, the doldrums of the off season, and I think, at least for me personally, started a new job a couple weeks ago, and have just been kind of getting everything scheduled out and ready to go, as we've got a 3-year-old ready to start preschool here in 2 weeks as well. So changes all around, but changes for good here as I come to you from just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, reporting on the Miami Dolphins. So we're here. Camp is slated to start, and I figured might as well chip in with my training camp preview episode. If you've listened to other Dolphins podcasts throughout the offseason, it's time. It's time for me to do one, and I apologize for the delay. On the show tonight, I figured the easiest way to do it is kind of go position by position and give a preview of what I expect to come. We'll probably do a 53-man roster prediction in the next couple weeks. One advantage of the new job is that I should be free to schedule a podcast every week, kind of starting next week through the end of the season, other than possibly the week of Thanksgiving. Might be traveling that week. But anyway, we'll kick off tonight's show. There is no whiskey review. It's a little late for me, and we've got 2 girls to get up early in the morning, but as promised, I will do the Lagavulin 11, the Nick Offerman Charred edition, when we do our next whiskey segment. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive into my preview of Dolphins Training Camp 2023. So we'll just go position by position. We'll start on offense, and we'll go to the defense and kind of walk our way through the roster, and then at the end, I'll give my thoughts on some of the things I'd like to see from the coaching staff as well. Now, again, I'm connected to several people who have gotten to see OTAs and minicamps, so some of this information is well known to the public because there are reporters amongst the people that I do know. Some of it I can't go into full detail with what I know because that information is embargoed, but I will do the best I can to paint an accurate picture for you based on what I know about the situations, and I'll add my own take on some things. So let's begin with quarterback. It's a position everyone's looking forward to seeing. It's kind of it is the make or break position for the Dolphins this year. Tua Tagovailoa showed us flashes of MVP level play last year, and then kind of faded once we went on the West Coast trip, the 3 straight road games, bounced back against Buffalo, then got injured and missed the rest of the season. So new helmet, new workout routine, up to 225 pounds with 10% body fat. All good things that don't really mean anything until you get on the field and play in week 1. That said, and this is probably my favorite note I got from anybody about Tua, during the OTAs and minicamp, it's simply Tua is Tua. There's no point in reporting about it because there's nothing bad to report. It's more interesting to talk about the backup competition. That was from one of the guys I know that's been to several of the practices. And that's kind of the thing. Tua is doing what Tua did last year. He's mastered the offense. He's completing passes. He's accurate. He's got the sense of timing down. One interesting tidbit, and I'll credit my buddy Reason, who does the Finside the NFL show. He had Tua's trainer, who also happens to be Dalvin Cook's trainer, Nick Hicks, on, I guess, about 2 months ago now, and talked about what they were working on in Tua's offseason regimen, and a lot of it was these 20 to 25 yard deep out, deep comeback, stop route throws. And when Nick said that, it immediately took me back to their game against the Chargers when Tua, had a rough night. The receivers had multiple drops. Tua was behind. Tua was late. The timing was off because the Chargers protected the middle of the field and did, the counterintuitive thing when you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle to cover. They jammed receivers and messed up the timing. Well, the perfect counter, and we'll segue here in a second, the perfect counter to all these in-breaking routes and these coverages of defenses of stacking the middle is being able to throw outside. And that's what Tua was working on. If you've had the chance or have already listened to the Athletics' Jordan Rodrigue and her Play Callers podcast series, I highly recommend you do. Mike McDaniel is on there, I think, in every episode, most of them, if not all. It's been a couple weeks since I've listened to it. But it was phenomenal, and it basically talked about how, for better or worse, the Sean McVay Rams offense was basically shut down by Vic Fangio and the Bears. And Sean McVay never really recovered until they started adding all these counter and option routes to the offense to be able to give quarterbacks the opportunity to read the defense and kind of adjust on the fly with the timing. Makes perfect sense as to what Mike McDaniel would want Tua to do and why he would be working on those outbreaking throws. So for me, we've gotten to the point where I think the sole question Tua has left is just health and staying healthy. And it's not just the concussions. There's a pretty lengthy injury history dating back to his days at Alabama. But he's the key to this Dolphins season. And I say that because based on the off-season notes, you don't want to have to rely on either Mike White or Skylar Thompson to play anything more than like a game or two. You don't want to have it be a case like last year where there were, 4 or 5 games at the end of the season where Tua couldn't play. You don't want to have that happen this year, obviously, but especially because, Mike White kind of struggled throughout the offseason. The sense of timing wasn't quite there. Hasn't really mastered the offense, which is a bit of a surprise because you would think, coming from the Jets, who had Mike LaFleur, who's off this Shanahan offense tree, he would have a little bit more of an understanding and maybe be a little further along in developing his timing with receivers as things go. And I guess you kind of hope this isn't too much of a cushy homecoming for him. Skylar Thompson, kind of the same deal. I think has a better understanding of things than he did as a 7th-round rookie. But there's still reports of him, missing throws against air, which you shouldn't be doing as an NFL quarterback. That being said, most of the reporters, even publicly, have kind of leaned and said Skylar Thompson outperformed Mike White during OTAs and minicamps. Not that that means a ton, but that's one battle I would be very intrigued to watch. If you go back to the spring, I kind of banged the table for paying Andy Dalton just because of his familiarity with a lot of the concepts within this Dolphins offense that he's run, mainly in Cincinnati, but at a couple other spots as well. But he is in Carolina, and the Dolphins have Mike White. Just a battle to keep your eye on. running back. That's sort of the big question mark right now, is will they or won't they end up with Dalvin Cook? I think that situation kind of plays itself out further down the road than maybe Dolphins fans want. It hasn't really struck me that there's ever really a close sense of the move happening with Miami. If you want a breakdown of it, I would again recommend my friend Reason's podcast with Nick Hicks. Nick Hicks is also a trainer of multiple NFL players, including multiple running backs. Dalvin Cook, in my opinion, the biggest name among them. But he had some great insight on that show. I don't want to steal any thunder from that show. All credit to Reason for getting Nick on and having that conversation. That's a good resource if you want the inside scoop on Dalvin Cook's process. I've seen some tweets. I haven't listened to the interview yet about Dalvin Cook being on the Rich Eisen show, saying that there is no offer on the table from Miami. Maybe not formally, but there is an offer that it's out there. I can confirm that. But Cook isn't here. Not here yet. If he becomes a Dolphin, I think that's more of an opportune time to discuss how he fits. One interesting stat, though, before we move on to guys that are actually Dolphins, and this is kind of what I found interesting, is last year, among running backs with a minimum of 10 attempts on 3rd and short, which is 3rd and 2 or less, Cook was the second worst in the NFL at converting those. Saquon Barkley was the only one worse. However, there are no Dolphins running backs on that list because they didn't qualify. That's sort of a play calling issue, and you go back to that road game in Buffalo in the regular season, and you wonder how many times could they have converted running the ball the way that they were in that game and built a bigger lead. Food for thought. As far as the running backs that are here, we kind of know what we're going to get with Raheem Mostert. He's been in the system, dating back to his 49ers days. You get speed, you get some pass catching ability, you get a good outside runner. And I think one of the interesting aspects of that play caller series is how back when Mike McDaniel was still with the 49ers, they kind of morphed their run scheme into this wide zone, heavy philosophy into more gap stuff. And we saw Miami hit that, and I think sort of the pinnacle of it last year was the home game against Cleveland right before the bye. Mostert and Jeff Wilson both had great performances that day. Each had a touchdown run. I think that was kind of Jeff Wilson's best day as a Dolphin. He's not really a big back by NFL standards. He's less than 215 pounds, but he's the biggest one the Dolphins can offer. Kind of more of between the tackles guy than Mostert, and as well as Ahmed. So he's kind of the counterpunch, I guess, to Raheem Mostert among the backs that were on the roster a year ago. And then obviously they drafted Devon Achane in the 3rd round, who has speed for days. I know of 2 NFL teams that graded him as a slot receiver on their draft boards versus a running back. If that gives you any indication of what NFL scouts think about his hands in the passing game, I think that's a very useful skill set to have in this offense, and I think it's something that was underutilized to a degree a year ago. I think you can make a lot more happen with someone like Devon Achane in the passing game out of the backfield. I also think he's got a sneaky ability to run between the tackles despite his size. I'll be very curious to see what weight he comes in at. They usually update that after the first practice or so. He was 192 coming out at the draft, and we know that he's had to cut weight in college because he also ran track at Texas A&M. So I don't know if I would be that shocked that if he's closer to like somewhere in between that like 198 to 205 range when they release the official weights for the team this year. I think by and large, provided Dalvin Cook does not end up a Dolphin, I think A-Chain ends up getting kind of more and more interspersed into the offense as we go throughout the season, and has the possibility of becoming the guy, air quotes there, in the offense. Not that Miami really has a bell cow back, but I think he would have the best chance to do that. Savon Ahmed, Myles Gaskin, both guys who were held over from the roster last year. Ahmed's shown flashes, but his path to playing, basically just got roadblocked by Devon A-Chain. I can't for the life of me think why Myles Gaskin would sign here unless he had no other offers, which may have been the case. And then they have Chris Brooks, the undrafted kid from BYU, who's a bigger back. Not sure he's got the NFL athletic pedigree, but maybe more of a specialty role. That doesn't strike me as something the Dolphins would want to use a roster spot on, but we'll see. And then Alec Ingold, of course, is the fullback. I was very impressed with his play last year, and he also managed to take a lot of snaps as an H-back and as a tight end. You can utilize him in that role again as well. And that kind of ties into something we'll talk about when we get to the receivers. But I think having a trio of Mostert, Wilson, and A-Chain with Ingold as a fullback is a pretty good start to the backfield. If you're able to add Dalvin Cook to it, great. If not, I think you're going to be fine. I don't know that you'll be a top 10 running attack, but it'll be better than last year. Now, wide receiver. The obvious ones here, Hill, Waddle. You can look up all the stats about duos and Tyreek Hill's pursuit of 2,000 yards, which was almost a possibility. I think it would have been a closer possibility had Tua not missed time at the end of the year. I think it's an attainable goal, especially with the 17th game in the regular season. And you can still feed Jalen Waddle plenty. Don't really have to talk about those guys much. We know what they do. We saw it all last year. They eat a big chunk of the pie, probably the biggest chunk of the pie when you look at all of the skill players and what they do within their respective roles. Now, I think with receiver, you look at the roster beyond Hill and Waddle, it seems pretty likely that Braxton Berrios is going to make it, at worst because he's a good kick and punt returner. So you probably figure he's a lock for the roster. Eric Ezukama, I think, is probably the most likely candidate to take on some of the blocking and slot and nasty split roles that Trent Sherfield had a week ago. And this was another point on the Play Callers podcast. What Sean McVay kind of learned coming up within the Washington Redskins organization was a lot of 12 personnel. And when he went to the Rams, they didn't really have a solid second tight end, but they realized Cooper Kupp was so good and so adaptable, you could run a lot of their 12 personnel stuff, even though you had 3 receivers, which is 11 personnel, on the field at the same time. You look at what Miami did last year, I think probably the big play that I would highlight is the big run that Raheem Mostert had in the Buffalo game, the road game in the regular season. Look at who's on the backside of the line of scrimmage. It's not a tight end. It's not Alec Ingold. It's Trent Sherfield. Eric Ezukama, 6'2", a little over 205, kind of the same build, physical player at Texas A&M. Not really a speed guy, more of a catch it and break tackles yak guy. Kind of fits that same mold as Trent Sherfield. And by all accounts, Ezukama looked much more comfortable in the offense. He had a nice preseason last year, but didn't always run routes the correct way and didn't always know the different options with the routes in the playbook. And that's per Wes Welker last year in the middle of the season. That's probably the biggest thing he had to get down, was learning that playbook. And I think he'll probably have a better grasp to where, I'm not saying he would be a number 3 receiver if you're going to rank him in the pecking order in terms of who gets the most targets. But I think he'll get a pretty good share of the snaps that are vacated from Trent Sherfield's role, especially those snaps that are in the slot, that are in tight alignments, that are in nasty split alignments, even some of the sift and the sniffer stuff that Trent Sherfield was used on for play action. That all seems to fall in line with how I would imagine they would use Eric Ezukama. Then you get, and gets interesting from there, because Miami's got a lot of talent at wide receiver. You have Cedric Wilson Jr., who kind of had a bad deal last year. He was going to be the number 2 receiver to Jalen Waddle, but then the Tyreek Hill trade materialized, and then Wilson broke ribs either in week 1 or week 2 and basically got shoved down the depth chart and never really regained his spot, became a kick and punt returner, and that was kind of it. You also bring in Robbie Chosen in free agency this year, who's kind of a tall, I won't say big body, but kind of a tall, also fast guy that you can put on the outside, which goes back to our point about Tua. If you can use him on the outside to kind of run these clear out routes, it gives you the opportunity to run 11 personnel and put one of the two between Hill and Waddle in the slot, so you can hit a lot of these outside breaking routes that are going to be counter punches to teams trying to pack the middle of the field the way the Chargers and 49ers did last year against Miami in those 2 ball games. So now, because you have added speed on the perimeter, you can use even more speed on the inside. And to take it a step further, if you're using 4 wide receivers, having someone like a Hill or a Waddle inside also gives you a deeper level you can hit, with someone like Braxton Berrios kind of being, the short to intermediate routes, attacking the flats and stuff underneath. Now you can run these, pyramid routes or over the ball routes, whatever you want to call it, with a Hill or a Waddle in the slot, with speed underneath and over the top of them with Robbie Chosen and Braxton Berrios. So I feel like those 5, unless Cedric Wilson, kind of outlasts Robbie Chosen in camp, are probably the 5 that make it. Just based on roster math, I feel like it's going to be tough to get a 6th on the team. And for as much as people talk about loving River Craycraft, they cut him out of camp a year ago. He was on the practice squad and got called up in weeks 2 and weeks 3. He didn't end up on the active roster either until the Cincinnati game or the Jets game. I can't remember exactly when he got called up. I guess it would have been Cincinnati. And then you've still got guys who have played NFL games in the past, Freddie Swain, Braylon Sanders, kind of as that fringe talent that makes your wide receiver room really deep. And if you can kind of smuggle one of those guys to the practice squad, even better for you. I think really the main battle is Robbie Chosen, Cedric Wilson Jr., River Craycraft, and Braylon Sanders for maybe 1-2 spots max is sort of the one to keep an eye on in camp. At tight end, it's pretty simple here. Like, beyond Durham Smythe, who signed an extension, what's the plan? Eric Saubert is a nice big body move tight end, but I think he's never really latched on in any of the 6 teams he's been on since he's entered the league. Is he anything more than, Mike Gesicki? Maybe a better blocking Mike Gesicki? I don't know. Tyler Kroft, veteran, good blocking tight end, probably suits you as a 3rd tight end in this offense, especially if you want to run. But if you're also trying to figure out a way to get Alec Ingold snaps, that's sort of a roadblock right there for Tyler Kroft. And then you have these 2 other guys in Tanner Connor and Elijah Higgins, and I suppose Julian Hill as well, the undrafted kid, as sort of, if you go back to those Washington days when McDaniel was on staff there, sort of like Jordan Reed. Not saying they're as good as Jordan Reed, but that kind of move tight end who can also be sort of a pseudo slot receiver. But again, if you have the opportunity to play Hill and Waddle in the slot more in 11 personnel and 10 personnel, I have a hard time seeing a role kind of carved out for either of those guys, to be completely honest. It wouldn't shock me if neither of them made the team, unless one of them's just a dynamite special teams player, which is what Durham Smythe was and continues to be, even though he's got a contract extension. It just kind of seems like tight end is sort of fixed at this point, and unless you can get yourself a George Kittle or a Rob Gronkowski, or dating back to Washington, like a Chris Cooley who can do everything really well, this just isn't going to be a big part of the passing game. As far as receiving goes, it's more about blocking, both in the run and pass game. The offensive line is where we'll go to next. The big questions there for me is Teron Armstead's health, and then Austin Jackson. Those are your two biggest if factors, especially if Isaiah Wynn ends up your left guard. I talked about this. He was the first team left guard pretty much all through minicamp. Now, Connor Williams, the center, is supposed to report to camp and participate per Drew Rosenhaus. That's a situation to kind of monitor. I still think Christian Wilkins is the big domino that gets everything rolling as far as contract extensions go. So Rob Hunt was also a free agent at the end of the year. But if you line up week one left to right with Armstead, Wynn, Williams, and Hunt, 4/5 of your line is, in my opinion, pretty good. You've got two elite players there in Armstead and Williams, and one who's rapidly ascending in Robert Hunt. But you still have a question with Austin Jackson. But if you have that same 4/5 group, I think what it does do is gives the Dolphins some of the better interior depth that they've had in a long time. You would have Dan Feeney, Liam Eichenberg, and Robert Jones all as depth inside that could play and has played at the NFL level, started games at the NFL level, and can help you navigate, missing someone for a couple games. Where it gets dicey, if you still have Austin Jackson as your right tackle, is what happens if/when Teron Armstead gets hurt again. Because your tackle depth is pretty lackluster. You have Kendall Lamb, who, played well in the game that we saw him play for, like a quarter and a half against New England. But that's a pretty small sample size to, want that versus what Brandon Shell gave you, or even Greg Little gave you at times a year ago. Cedric Ogbuehi, has been a bust ever since the Bengals drafted him. He's never really latched on. He's never been a competent NFL starter. It's probably a tackle that Austin Jackson is better than, which there aren't a ton of those guys, just objectively speaking. And beyond those two guys, you've got Ryan Hayes, who's a short-armed, tall tackle who's probably moving inside to guard, and James Tunstall from the University of Cincinnati, who I don't necessarily think has the feet to play tackle in the NFL either. So that's a position that kind of worries me as far as the Dolphins specifically. But as a whole, that right tackle spot is kind of the one glaring area you look at on paper and say, okay, if there's a weakness we have to protect against, this is it. And that's it. It's one. not a whole lot of times, since Dan Marino was the Dolphins quarterback, we could say you've got one weakness to protect. And you can do it through a number of ways, through scheme, through sliding the line away from Teron Armstead, through using your backs to help, tight ends to help, especially the blocking capable tight ends that the Dolphins do have with Smythe and Croft. There are ways to cover up that weakness. So offensively, I think as long as Tua stays healthy, you're going to get better production than you got a year ago. And we'll kind of discuss some of the philosophical reasons why at the end when we talk about the coaching staff. But just that comfortability level that the players have going into year 2 of this offense. That was another point mentioned, especially by Dan Quinn, who was the coach of the Falcons when Matt Ryan was the MVP, the 28-3 year. That comfortability factors, leads to some pretty big jumps. And Travis Wingfield of Dolphins.com had a really great podcast about 2 or 3 months ago now that kind of detailed the history of this offense taking off in year 2 from a production standpoint. So a lot of things to be pretty excited about for the Dolphins offensively. But the biggest splashes the Dolphins made this offseason, unlike last year with the Tyreek Hill trade, came on the defensive side of the ball, adding defensive coordinator, kind of the guru of stopping this Shanahan, McVay, McDaniel system, Vic Fangio, cornerback Jalen Ramsey from the Los Angeles Rams, and inside linebacker David Long Jr. from the Tennessee Titans. I think the Dolphins, by all accounts, have a ton of firepower defensively, especially in the secondary to withstand injuries, which they did not have a year ago. It seems like they've rectified that mistake. They've adapted the scheme to kind of be able to counter some of the better quarterbacks you're going to face. And if you're going to be a playoff team in the AFC, which I fully expect the Dolphins to be, if you're going to be a playoff team in the AFC, you're going to see Patrick Mahomes, a Joe Burrow, probably a Josh Allen, and then you have up-and-coming guys, Tua, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, Lamar Jackson can still play very well. Deshaun Watson is in this conference. There's a lot of talent. You have Sean Payton out in Denver with Russell Wilson. I'm not quite sure how that mix would go, but you would think Russell Wilson can at least improve upon where he was last year. And obviously the Jets, the division rivals, have Aaron Rodgers. There's a ton of quarterback talent in the AFC. You've got to be able to combat that talent, and sitting in cover 1 and cover 3 with 0 blitz packages running all game just isn't the way to do it. So getting Fangio was a huge boost. Now, looking at the defensive positions, I'm going to break these down a little bit differently. And there's some flexibility here, so you could add a couple names to each position group and I wouldn't fight you. I'll start with the interior defensive line. And if you wanted to throw Emmanuel Ogbah's name in here, I wouldn't disagree with you. Just for record-keeping purposes and how I organized sort of my, we'll call it the shot sheet for the podcast, I'm going to list Emmanuel Ogbah as an edge player, and I'll tell you why when we get to those guys. So the big three, Christian Wilkins, Zach Sealer, Raekwon Davis, all of those guys are in their contract years. They're playing for new deals. We know Christian Wilkins has been in talks with the Dolphins. I think you've got sort of the market and the market high price points laid out for you between Dexter Lawrence, Deron Payne, and then what Quinnen Williams got. You probably need to beat the Chiefs to the punch getting Chris Jones done to get this deal done. I still have been told it's going to get done. It's just a matter of when and not if. If something should change, I would report that here. I don't know when they will get it done, but I have confidence it does get done. And I think part of that philosophy in wanting to pay someone like Christian Wilkins, who's a really tremendous run stopper, arguably the best in the league by any metric you look at, is because you're going to be playing so many light boxes with Vic Fangio. And by light, I mean having 6 guys in the box. Your defensive tackles are going to be tasked with stopping a lot of those interior runs. He's literally the best in the NFL in run-stop win rate and run-stop percentage. Pay him. Sealer isn't far behind, and in a lot of the fronts that you're going to see from Fangio, his 4-2 nickel front using 2-4 personnel, it's essentially a wide 9 front, which is a run defense front. It sounds counterintuitive, but if you go back and listen to Jim Schwartz talk about how he and Jim Washburn co-created this thing, the original purpose of the front was to stop the Indianapolis Colts stretch zone play with Edgerrin James back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Kind of sounds familiar to having to stop this whole Shanahan offense as detailed in the Play Caller series. Fangio's nickel is basically a wide 9 front, which is why they probably felt comfortable with David Long, but we'll talk about him in the off-ball linebackers. So I think Wilkins, Davis, Sealer, all going to play similar roles, especially in the 3-4 packages that Fangio has. You're probably going to see Wilkins and Sealer play the lion's share of the snaps. I would imagine they'll ask Emmanuel Ogbah to play some 3 technique, some 4-eye, some 4 technique, especially if Fangio wants to run his penny front, which is a 3-3-5 with your outside linebackers walked up to make it into a 5-1. Similar to like the tilt front that the Patriots ran against the Rams in the Super Bowl. That was something they took from Vic Fangio, who had played them earlier that year when he was the D coordinator of the Bears. This is the archetype. So beyond those kind of 3 or 4 guys, and I think Raekwon Davis might have a little bit of a spark if he gets to play some more 1 technique and 2-eye in this system as opposed to being a head-up nose. But beyond those guys, you've basically got Josiah Bronson with any NFL playing experience, and he played in 1 game for the Dolphins last year. You have Jalen Twyman, who was on the practice squad, couldn't get elevated. And then you've got Brandon Peely, who was an undrafted free agent from USC, Anthony Montalvo from UCF. None of those guys outside of Josiah Bronson really strike me as guys that have the potential to make the roster. Now, by all accounts, Bronson's had himself a pretty nice offseason. Again, it's OTAs, it's minicamp, it's not, real football. But it seems like he's got his role down, at least from a mental perspective. I wonder if this is an area that Miami kind of scours as we go through camp. If you recall last year, they signed both Melvin Ingram and Trey Flowers as outside linebacker depth in training camp. So it makes me wonder if you get a week or 2 into camp and you're not seeing like you have enough depth. Do you give Akeem Hicks a call? Do you give Shelby Harris a call? Do you give Mike Purcell a call? All guys who've played under Fangio in this system. I think you've got the opportunity to still add some depth there. And it might even be a thing, too, where you need some of these contractual situations to work themselves out to free up the cap room. The Wilkins situation, Dalvin Cook, possibly Connor Williams as well. So those are the interior guys. Maybe you have someone like Brandon Peely who surprises. They gave him the second most guaranteed money of any undrafted free agent they signed. So maybe there's some hope there that he can develop. Feel much better about the edge group. Now again, like I said, there's some flexibility here. You can also list Andrew Van Ginkel in this group. I have chosen to list him as an off-ball linebacker. So the big 4 edge guys I have are Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, Emmanuel Ogbah, and Malik Reed. You're probably going to see Van Ginkel play here some in base packages. Miami was pretty good about rotating Chubb and Phillips last year with Ingram and Van Ginkel. Probably a similar thing this year, especially on rundowns. Ogbah gives you some position flexibility because he can play as a true defensive end with his hand in the dirt. He can play some of the tighter to the ball, looks like a 3 technique, a 4-eye, that you're probably not going to see from these guys. You also have opportunities within the defense to see some of these guys drop. Fangio, believe it or not, actually has a Tampa 2 package where you're dropping a middle linebacker down the field and replacing him with an athletic edge guy underneath. Andrew Van Ginkel can do that. Jalen Phillips can likely do that. There are some things to look for in these edge players other than pass rush in this defense that are going to be pretty unique as compared to what we saw from Brian Flores and Josh Boyer. You also have some interesting depth pieces. Mitchell Agude from the U kind of tore up the second and third teamers in OTAs and minicamp. Maybe he had some juice in training camp. I always kind of caution those types of performances from D linemen because look at the list. Ikaika Alama-Francis, AJ Francis, Julius Wormsley, who was the guy last year, Porter Gustin, Cameron Good. These guys make plays in camp with no pads and not real football, and they make one tackle in a preseason game, and, they're the next Lawrence Taylor or Aaron Donald. Just be wary of that. I also really like Garrett Nelson as a developmental guy. I think he's more of a guy you would try and stash on the practice squad, but for an edge player, pretty strong guy. Played as a true D-end at Nebraska. Undersized as for a true D-end. That's someone I think you can get some growth out of by playing on the practice squad for a year or two. But just watch out for the hype, around young guys that do well in OTAs and minicamp before you get the vets mixed in and playing real ball with real pads on. Nothing against Mitchell Agude. I hope he does well. Cool story if you check out his background and how he went from UCLA to the Miami Hurricanes. But let's just see what he does. As far as off-ball guys, I think there's 4 probable locks to make it. Pretty certain about 3 of those: David Long Jr., Jerome Baker, and Duke Riley. The 4th one, Channing Tindall, might have some competition for that roster spot. But you're also going to see Andrew Van Ginkel play here in the nickel. Like I said, his nickel front, Fangio's nickel front, is a wide 9 front. You either need to be really fast and athletic, or you need to be big and physical as an off-ball linebacker in this defense to be able to either beat blocks or engage and defeat blocks to stop the run. Now, David Long is one of the best run-stopping linebackers in the league when he's on the field. Go look at the performance he had against the Packers last year, and, that tape is basically the coach's tape for what you would want at this position. One other benefit is he's pretty damn good as a blitzer. He had the 6th highest pass rush grade for all off-ball linebackers last year per Pro Football Focus, and his 23.4% win rate was the highest by almost a full 7% over the next highest player. So a good blitzer, really fast, really athletic, can do a lot of stuff in coverage. I think he's your new 3-down guy, which allows you to give Jerome Baker a bit of a break. You can use him as a blitzer. You can use him as a coverage guy. You can take him off the field if you're playing a run-heavy team like, New England or Tennessee, someone like that. Duke Riley, good backup player, fairly athletic, good special teams guy. Beyond those guys, though, you've got Channing Tindall, who, for as complex as the Georgia Bulldogs defensive playbook is, which is probably more complex than any NFL playbook, you'd think he would have a better grasp on the defense at this point, and maybe it's more of just a, how do I play fast type of situation versus overthinking everything. He's got the physical tools to be really good in this defense, just has to put it together, and I hope they give him some opportunities. A lot of noise about Aubrey Miller, the undrafted kid out of Jackson State. Kind of fits that same mold as all those guys, kind of undersized, strong for his size, athletic, maybe not the same athlete that you're going to get out of Long, Baker, and Tyndall, but maybe comparable in some respects to Andrew Van Ginkel. And then, unfortunately, Zeke Vandenberg, who was an edge rusher at Illinois State, was converting to inside linebacker, was placed on injured reserve. So I don't know if that's a season-ending one or what, but that's where he is as of right now. Moving on to the secondary, this is where it gets pretty exciting because you spent big resources on bringing Jalen Ramsey here. You spent a second-round pick on Cam Smith. You signed Deshaun Elliott. You brought back Nick Needham. There are resources here in the secondary. There is depth in the secondary, particularly at corner, where I think you have a very solid top four of Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard, Kader Kohou, and Cam Smith. You've currently got Nick Needham on the pup. But if your fifth corner is Nick Needham, you're doing something right because he's the three corner on a lot of teams around the league. I think with Fangio's scheme, we've talked about this on previous episodes with how you're going to interchange Kohou and Ramsey, how you have certain coverages where you're basically bumping over to where a corner is going to end up playing a deep half like a safety. You couldn't have a better tandem to do those interchangeable roles than Ramsey and Kohou. And Xavier Howard should be able to thrive, whether it's quarters or you're playing on the half side, where he can basically keep everything in front of him, click and close to the ball. Again, I'll be bullish on it. I think if he stays healthy, he's getting 6 or 7 interceptions this year. You're going to have opportunities to put him in advantageous positions where he can trap in coverage and kind of freestyle a little bit and bait quarterbacks to throw to his side. I think he'll have a renaissance year and would probably be well within his rights to stay a Dolphin beyond the season. I know everyone is obsessed with shedding cap and all of that. Wouldn't surprise me if Xavier Howard makes himself a case to stay. That's based on a number of people talking about X and how his focus is and how driven he is for this year to have a bounce back and the system on top of it. I think it's a much more player-friendly system, especially to corners, than he's been used to playing under Flores and Boyer. You also have a pair of really nice special teamers at corner with Justin Bethel and Keon Crossan. I think the question is, do you keep one or both, especially if someone like Needham starts the year on PUP? And by start the year, I mean into the regular season. There's some interesting questions. You have Noah Igbenogany, who's in the final year of his contract, didn't pick up the 5th-year option, obviously. You save $1.14 million roughly if you cut him against the cap, but you owe him a little over $2.4 million in dead money. To me, I think that's worth it just to get him off the roster. And then there's some noise about Bryce Thompson, the kid who played in the XFL for the Seattle Sea Dragons, went to college at the University of Tennessee, made some nice plays in OTAs and minicamp, where it's basically 7-on-7 anyway. So maybe there's a little bit more you can read and glean from receiver DB battles. But I think the thing I'm most interested in seeing is what they do as far as rotating Kohou and Ramsey, and even to a degree Cam Smith, because he played in the slot some at South Carolina. At the very least, he's excellent depth for you outside and a possible starter, in year 2. You've got a lot of options, especially if Nick Needham comes back. Elijah Campbell played in the slot last year, might be more of a safety in this system, but there's depth. There's plenty of depth this year that you didn't have a year ago. At safety, I think the simple note here about Javon Holland is he should absolutely thrive in this system. A lot of the stuff is predicated on the weak side safety, which would be Javon Holland in most circumstances. You can bring him closer to the line of scrimmage. You can give him different coverage assignments. He has easier accessibility in terms of his run fits in this defense. And he's always been a great tackler. I think he'll make a ton of plays in this system. I think the big question is what happens next to him. It sounds like Brandon Jones is good to go and cleared, not on PUP for the start of camp. Deshaun Elliott missed minicamp with some sort of undisclosed injury, but sounds like he'll be good to go as well. Curious to see what Vic Fangio does with those two guys. Barry Jackson has reported that they're very high on Brandon Jones. I think a lot of Jones's coverage metrics have vastly improved since his rookie year, but you weren't giving him a ton of difficult assignments in that Flores-Boyer defense. But he is a really good tackler, especially in space, and I think that's a huge key in this defense because you're basically trying to stretch it out horizontally against the run versus funneling things to the middle like we saw under Flores and Boyer. So the ability to come down from a safety perch and tackle is huge. I think Holland can do it well. I think Jones can do it well. Deshaun Elliott has done it well at times, especially when he was with Baltimore. You can look at the hit he put on Derrick Henry in the open field. Pretty impressive. He did not play against the Dolphins last year when Miami went to Detroit, so you can't go back and watch that game. But another big body safety, 6'1", 210, good tackler downhill. I have kind of flipped through all 194 pages of the copy of Vic Fangio's Bears playbook I have. Don't really see anything on him having a big nickel formation, but I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility, especially with how athletic Javon Holland is. Beyond those three guys, though, I think there's some open spots, and I was told by two people, keep an eye on Keidron Smith. Smith was an undrafted free agent from the University of Kentucky, played corner at Kentucky, played safety at Ole Miss prior to that. He got the most guaranteed money of all the Dolphins free agents. Good size, 6'2", a little over 200 pounds, built pretty similarly to Justin Simmons, who was a Denver Broncos all-pro safety under Fangio. Interesting developmental prospect to have. Good athlete. You can use him in some certain coverage assignments. He's used to playing outside on an island at times. We talked about, Elijah Campbell was a good special teams guy. It's been rumored that Trill Williams, who gets more hype than anyone for having played in one NFL game, rumored to be moving to safety as well to try and compete there. So Verone McKinley, Bennett Williams, some other names. I don't know how well McKinley would fit this system, but a bigger guy like Bennett Williams from Oregon might be worth watching as well as an undrafted free agent. And that takes us to the specialists. I think Jason Sanders kind of acquitted himself well after some of the missed kicks early in the year. He's got a fully guaranteed contract, so, it's kind of sink or swim with Sanders, but I have faith in him. Kind of surprised that Blake Ferguson does not have any kind of long snapping competition. He was not good on actual long snaps, i.e. punts, a year ago. You have a punter competition to a degree. Jake Bailey's contract is almost fully guaranteed. You have Michael Turk coming from Oklahoma. His uncle, Matt Turk, was a punter for the Dolphins, 20 some odd years ago. You don't really get a good gauge of those battles until you see the preseason start. And to wrap up this behemoth of an episode, the coaching points I think I would like to see improved, and I call it the order of operations. How quickly does Mike McDaniel get plays in? What's the system of getting guys lined up so you can get guys in motion? give Tua information so he can see what the defense is doing and how to react to it. How does McDaniel get better at that? So you look at that playoff game against Buffalo, you basically got shoehorned in because you couldn't get a play in time and lost that game. Third downs and play calling. I think we talked about this the last episode. Miami's EPA per down, they were 6th best in the NFL on first downs. I think they fell to like 17th or 18th on second down, and they were like 27th on third down, especially third and long. We're not very good at converting last year. I don't think they were very good at converting third and shorts either, though, and I kind of wonder how much more emphasis you can put on the running game to be creative, especially if you do end up getting Dalvin Cook to kind of alleviate some of those third down concerns. And then finally, the penalties. You've got to clean up on offensive penalties. It's, for all his faults, it's something that Brian Flores practiced. They literally practiced not having penalties in game situations. It was rampant last year. You go back to that Minnesota game, basically cost you the game early on because Skylar Thompson came out cooking, and you kept having holding penalties and false start penalties. That kind of got the offense stuck in quicksand in that game. So those would be the points to kind of clean up for Mike McDaniel. It'll be interesting to watch and see the reports that filter in throughout training camp about that. Does the TNT wall come back? Anyway, I'm just excited for football. It's been a behemoth of an episode, approaching an hour-long podcast episode. I'm excited to be back. We'll have more regular content this year. Thank you guys for listening. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker. Follow guys like Travis Wingfield, Reason, the reporters, especially Cameron Wolf, Daniel Oyefusi, for really good content during camp. And follow us here on DolphinsTalk.com. Listen to all the podcasts. Thank you guys. Football's almost here. First practice Wednesday. Fins up.